So welcome to Power Through the Pandemic. Thank you for tuning in. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Jessie Ma. I am an IESO Research Fellow at Ryerson's Center for Urban Energy. I want to begin by acknowledging that Toronto, the land on which we're hosting this webinar, is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee, and that treaty bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. 2020 has been a year like no other. Back in March, all of our lives were profoundly changed with the spread of COVID-19. As our behavior changed, so have our electricity consumption habits. Businesses, factories, and offices had to close. Millions of people began working from home. Millions of others were no longer able to work. Our electricity system remained effective throughout all this, and utilities across the province kept the grid running without any major interruptions. Electricity consumption patterns changed overnight. Overall demand dropped. Commercial and industrial loads fell while residential consumption rose. As our province progressed through stages 1, 2, and 3, our overall electricity use also increased to levels even beyond those in the recent past during those summer heat waves. Our mandate here at Ryerson Center for Urban Energy, or CUE for short, is to create sustainable solutions for our urban energy challenges. We do this through academic industry partnerships in a nonpartisan manner to deliver scientific solutions, primarily in the intersection of engineering and economics. As part of our mission, we convene sessions like this one to advance the public discourse about the future of energy. This also informs the cutting-edge research that we create. Now, today, in the midst of a global pandemic, is the perfect time to explore this together. Our hour-long session has 3 main parts. First, we will take a look backwards and explore what major changes we've seen since March, both with respect to the electricity system, but also the greater societal impacts. Second, we will spend some time talking about what we expect to see in the future, and in particular, ideas for how we can all be part of the recovery in rebuilding a more resilient electricity system and society. Lastly, we will reserve some time for questions and answers from the audience. We will use Zoom's Q&A feature for this, and Bala Venkatesh, our academic director, will moderate this portion. But please do start thinking about your questions now. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We're so glad to have them with us. Their full professional biographies are on the event website, so I won't go through all the impressive details. But very quickly, we have Saad Rafi, who is a senior advisor to the Mayor of Toronto for the city's recovery and rebuild. Saad's career has spanned over 3 decades in both the public and private sectors, and notably, he's been the Deputy Minister for both energy and health, 2 topics that are very relevant for today's session. So welcome, Saad. We're glad that you're here. We also have Chuck Farmer. He is the Senior Director of Power System Planning at the Independent Electricity System Operator, or IESO. Chuck leads the planning of Ontario's electricity system with a focus on assessing the adequacy of electricity supply and the transmission system itself to identify system needs and the options to meet them. So welcome, Chuck. Thank you for joining us. So let's start our session by looking to the past, and let's review what's happened since March. Chuck, I know you have a few slides to show us the electricity demand patterns from March till now, and maybe we can start by looking at these. Go ahead.
So thank you, Jessie, and thank you everyone for attending. And to set a little context for what we went through over the last number of months, and we've all gone through things that frankly are unprecedented, and society has had to adapt to on the fly, and that's very much true of what happened to us as the electricity system operator as we struggled to deal with the rapid change and evolution of demand patterns in the province. And what you can see in this particular slide is what happened to demand relative to what we would have expected to see given the weather conditions that we were experiencing. And you can see that very quickly demand dropped in the province. Total electricity demand dropped over the course of a few weeks into about the 12% range overall, and stayed there. And at this point in time, our focus was very much on adapting to this change. As Jessie said, we were seeing a very different pattern of consumption as people stay at home. You don't get the morning ramps that you would normally expect to see. This happening in what we consider a shoulder season. You also are dealing with overnight surpluses that you have to manage. So we are having a lot of changes very quickly, and our models, which are based primarily on historical observations, were really just not in sync because everything had changed extremely quickly. And at this point, we thought this looked a little bit like a recession. So we were trying to take lessons from 2008, 2009, and the early 90s, when some significant recessions hit. And then we start to see the reopening of the economy in stages, and you start to see what became a little bit of a predictable bounce back as we headed into May, and things were working well. But then we got, I would suggest, caught off guard by heat, and particularly we were not ready for the amount of air conditioning load that we would see. Our assumption was that it had moved from the offices to homes, but the reality was that with the number of people at home, the nature of the weather we got, the peaks started to go well above where we would have expected them to be, and the energy demand shot up, which really was not in our expectations. As we go to the next slide, so what we can see here is what was really happening, and the left columns are the energy consumption. So this is the number of megawatt hours that we are consuming as a whole, and on the right is the peak. And you can see in the early stages of this, they're actually moving relatively in lockstep. The energy has dropped, the peak reductions have dropped, and we're really dealing with low demand and the operability challenges that low demand creates. But then we start to see the weather kick in. We had an early heat wave in May, which gave us some early signals that heat was going to be an issue we would have to deal with, and more in June. And you can see them disconnecting. So the overall energy is not being affected in the same way that the peaks are being affected. And then when we hit our July, I believe it was 9th, if I'm not mistaken, heat wave through that period, we actually saw a peak demand on the system that was higher than we've seen since 2013. So we're dealing with a very considerable peak event, and yet the energy is about where we would expect it to be. And to sort of emphasize that this was really a story of heat, as we go to the last slide, what you can see, I'll just get one more slide, thank you. There we go. So this is what was happening on the very sort of hot days and in the heat waves. And you can see that overall, the demand from the commercial, the distribution connected small industrial and commercial, and the very large industrial that is connected to the transmission system, you can see all of those are down, and they're down because they're reacting to the healthcare, the health event, and they're closed or they're not operating at full potential. But there in the residential, you can see the extreme increases that we saw through the heat waves. And, historically, you would say that residential, commercial, industrial were about the same amount of demand, and so one is not that impactful. But industrial is a much smaller part of our economy now, sort of in the 20 to 25% range. And so events in the commercial and residential sector are more impactful on the system and on the overall demand, as they're a much bigger portion. So these were the observations we had in the heat waves. Overall, where we're at right now, just to wrap it up, is that the large industrial, commercial, small industrial, we still see them as being down in about 4 to 6% from where we would normally expect them to be. And I suggest this is now, we're sort of transitioning out of what is a health event into an economic event. And so it's starting to look a little more like we would expect during a recession. But the residential is still, 8% higher than we would expect to see, reflecting the number of people that are working from home that the schools are not fully reopened, etc. So we're still in a time of a different set of demand circumstances. We think of it as demand is evolving, and I think that's part of the conversation, is how will this continue to evolve as we look forward and try to think about what's next. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chuck. That's I found it very interesting that the while industrial and commercial was down, residential more than made up for it, both in terms of energy and demand. So Saad, I'd like to go to you, and we just saw some numbers and graphs about what happened on the electricity system. Could you help us by putting a human face to that? What did that translate to on the ground? What did that look like for our city and our province?
Sure, thank you very much. And again, Jessie and Vala, thank you for the opportunity to be here on this webinar today. I think I'll address some of the really interesting points Chuck's made in work from home arrangements in a second. But I think what we've also seen is that this pandemic has exacerbated conditions for those who either had essential work requirements, couldn't be at home and work from home arrangements, or those who were unfortunately affected by a lack of employment, as you said at the outset. And this has skewed more to Black and Indigenous communities, and I think it's exacerbated and made worse by the precarity of work, housing conditions, being unable to isolate properly in various housing conditions as well, lack of childcare availability due to the emergency, of course. And so we'll need to address that going forward, and I'm sure we're going to get to that part of those opportunities and impacts. But the work from home arrangements, sort of anecdotally, we're hearing from major employers that these may continue for quite some time, both based on employees' desire to be absolutely certain of a few things. Obviously, the safety of the work environment, the safety of getting to the work environment, and of course what's going to develop and happen in the school environment and the availability of childcare. So interesting to see the residential impacts on energy consumption and demand. Sounds like that in the core of the city and amongst major employers, especially in information type sectors, will continue for some time. And in some cases, we're seeing the Googles and the Shopifys and others saying that they may not come back for quite some time, if at all. And we're seeing others who have to grapple with physical distancing requirements, reducing full capacity to perhaps maybe as low as 10 to 25% of their previous capacity. So that means 75% of workers will have to continue with looking at work from home arrangements. Some other effects on that, of course, is the impact in the downtown core and the ecosystem of support services and companies that provide support to these employees and employers. And that has an impact on those employers, that has an impact on those landlords, and of course, that has an impact on those small businesses. So I think, these are some things that will need some long-term examination, both as their impact on energy demand, various types of energy that we might look at, and I'll leave those technical aspects to Chuck. He knows way more about that than I ever will. And then, of course, we also have sort of the recreation and cultural, social pursuits of our lives, where, as we know, cultural industries have been absolutely hammered by this due to, especially for festivals and events, and but that then gets us to virtual solutions and digitized solutions, and what kind of a draw will that be, and what kind of demand does that put on things like broadband and so on. So that's by no means a thorough assessment, but maybe there's a few examples there, and I was probably remiss in not starting by saying that, for many, if not all of us, we're still in the response phase of this pandemic. There is no, set time where recovery begins and ends, and rebuilding starts, or building back better starts. Many of us are still finding ourselves having to grapple with children at school, childcare arrangements, perhaps the stress of working from home as well for some cohorts of employees as well. So I think we need to be cognizant of that too when we talk about short, medium, and long-term solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Saad. It's very important to realize, our electricity system, it's meant to support our way of life. It's meant to support society so that we can all grow, thrive as people, as communities, and as businesses as well. So thank you for showing us the other side of that as well. So we talked about electricity demand and consumption, but that's also very much related and tied into electricity pricing. So Chuck, maybe we'll start with you on electricity pricing. Can you tell us about some of the pricing changes that have happened since March, and what were some of the consequences of those? Thanks.
So thank you. Yeah, so there were some moves taken on pricing. The government, the provincial government, wanted to sort of ease the burden, I think would be the way I would put it, and also encourage people through the downturn and into the recovery. And so there were two areas that affected electricity consumption. The first was the move away from time of use rates, and so setting it first at the lowest rate and then moving that to the middle rate a little bit later was designed to accommodate the fact that people are at home, people are working from home. It is more difficult to shift your time of use, your energy usage. So putting a rate on that, and we don't actually have good data to tell us what the impact of that was. The data on the peak reductions related to time of use is not very strong. And so we don't have a lot of information. And our sense is that this particular change, while there would have been an impact, it got lost in the bigger impacts of the changed lifestyle patterns. So not such a big one. But then the second one was much more impactful on the system. And that was, for those familiar with the Industrial Conservation Initiative, basically large customers are incented to reduce their consumption during peak events. That means we don't have to buy as much of a peak resource. That saves the system money. And so what those customers will do is they'll curtail their load. They might change their production patterns. And the government's position was very much that industrial customers shouldn't be curtailing as we go into the recovery phase. They should be focusing on their business. And so the government placed that program on what's called hiatus. For 1 year. So basically, industrial customers don't have to respond. Now, this one was a little bit more impactful because before we got into COVID, we would typically see about 1,600 megawatts of response, which on a sort of 24,000 megawatt system is quite substantial. As we went into COVID, we saw those responses initially as we got into the hot weather, they were declining. We were getting about 1,000 to 1,200, partly because if an industry is shut down, it's not going to be able to shut down further. So you were seeing some curtailment anyway. And then when the government put it on hiatus, we were getting really no response because there was no reason for anyone to respond. And so this sort of added, in our opinion, about 1,000 to 1,200 megawatts of demand, which contributed to sort of our peak, which approached 26,000, was not getting the Industrial Conservation Initiative response that we would have gotten at that time. Now, full disclosure, before the decision was made, we were asked whether there was a reliability concern with putting the program on hiatus. We did a lot of analysis and confirmed that indeed there would not be a reliability concern. And so, we were able to accommodate that, and reliability was maintained through the heat waves.
Good. Thanks, Chuck. So Saad, let's talk about take a more systems approach to this. We've heard about some of the electricity pricing policies from the past 6 months, but the electricity pricing it's one piece of the big puzzle in our economic model and the social contract that we have. And you mentioned some of the cracks that we were seeing in that economic model. Could you talk a bit more about that and any particular ties, especially as it relates to energy and electricity as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the depth of analysis on the impacts that pricing has had, but I mean, I think it stands to reason that Toronto has a bulk of the towers, rental towers, in the country. And I think it stands to reason that if you look at the socioeconomic makeup of renters and the affordability of that rental stock, that food, energy, other staples play a large part in those household expenses. And so, you know, if your income is impacted, if not lost, and you have buildings that are somewhat inefficient, I will leave it to participants and others to assess whether those buildings are efficient or not efficient. I suspect they verge more towards inefficiency. Then I think, you know, at best, if there's a postponement of payment, it doesn't matter, because of course those bills will still be there to have to be paid. So I think this comes back to a recurring theme of a need for continued vigilance on resiliency, not just from a climate and infrastructure perspective. And I know we'll talk more about a broad definition of resilience, but to me, there's you know, economic, job resilience, as well as, of course, efficiency of distribution, efficiency of generation as well. So I would just say anecdotally that that's the first thing that comes to mind, is those people who are less able to withstand the shock of increasing my demand at home and paying those additional bills, as Chuck pointed out, in terms of a heat wave, just being at home 24/7, not being able, you know, you're not even away for a vacation. So that's one thing. But I think for others, this just is another thing that's added on top of their financial burdens.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Saad. Yeah, it's important to keep that in mind as we build an inclusive society that works for everybody. So as we wrap up this first part about looking backwards, I wanted to ask both of you, in the past 6 months, what were our lessons learned? I mean, everybody was trying their best based on the information we had to the best of our abilities. But of course, we got some things right. We probably didn't get other things right. Maybe we could take a look backwards and identify one or two things that you thought, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing what we know today, what could we have done better? Chuck, let's start with you.
So I actually would say that I think we did quite well. You know, and so things that we had done proved to help us through the situation. So we as many organizations do, had a pandemic plan that came really as a result of SARS. And so while the plan maybe wasn't perfect for this event, we had a starting point, and we were able to engage that plan. Leadership took action relatively quickly. So, you know, I think things like that were very, very important. In terms of operating a system, I think the lesson I learned is you know, you've got to have good people. You've got to trust people. So as our models went, I'll describe it as sideways, because they weren't able to track the rapid changes. We had a very good team that knows the system and that works on analysis, and they were very quickly able to get information in and keep things going, working very closely with the control room. And access to data for us was extremely important. And so we have a smart meter entity which takes in all of the meter data, and we were able to get access to that and see what was happening and be able to pick it apart, which helped us build our models back up as the economy reopened. So, you know, I think the lesson is be prepared for many eventualities, have good people, and trust those people.
Thanks, Chuck. Saad, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I'd sort of pick up on that as well. I think, you know, many companies I spoke with and governments as well, I think found that their ability to quickly innovate, their ability to shift the delivery of many of their services to digital platforms that might have taken them, as one company executive said to me, this would have taken us 5 years to figure out, if not for the impetus that was given to us by the necessary moves that the provincial government had to undertake. So I think that you know, that's heartening. It's heartening for those companies. It's heartening for those governments who've seen that they can quickly pivot. And as Chuck says, that speaks to people, that speaks to leadership, that speaks to an unprecedented level of cooperation and coordination amongst governments, which has proven to be, you know, just a fantastic example of I think a truly Canadian response. And I think that these things will continue to serve us well because, of course, you know, we're in twindemics potentially as we look to the precipice of a resurgence. We have other shocks and crises that may be upon us that we just need to be prepared for. And business continuity plans will be tested yet again as they have been this time. I think as well, though, it's allowed companies, governments as well to, you know, especially those international companies, as this pandemic moved from east to west, they had a chance to take a look at what solutions were in place in other jurisdictions and how did that help them with being prepared a few steps beforehand. So the international nature of Ontario as a jurisdiction, be that multinational subsidiaries, be that the diversity of the economy and of the people in the economy, and the fact that governments are always quite willing to share ideas and experiences amongst themselves, regardless of where they find themselves in the world. So I think those are the positives. I think that it's also demonstrated that we need to continue to be vigilant about resiliency. And people are probably going to get tired of hearing me use that word over the course. I will try other variants of it through the course of this webinar. But it really has, of course, demonstrated that, you know, we have infrastructure, mobility, economy, worker, job, resilient challenges. And I think that we need to, coming out of this, we need to take advantage of what that gives us as an opportunity for many elements that we'll get into probably in your next series of questions. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. So that's a good point to pivot to looking to the future. We spent some time looking at the past 6 months. Let's look to the future, and I'd love to hear from both of you on what would the best case scenario look like in the future? Could you help like paint that picture for us in 5 years or 10 years? What do we want our city and our province to look like? And the natural follow-up question to that is, what do we need to do now to get there? Chuck, let's start with you.
Well, I'll defer on what we want our city to look like. As a resident of Toronto, I love the city, and I have high hopes for where the city is going and great trust in the leadership. But in terms of the electricity system in the province, you know, where are we going? Well, we're going where we've always tried to go, which is to have a reliable and affordable electricity system. Our system is very clean. It currently, about 93% of the energy is not produced from an emitting source. We use the gas fleet to balance the system and handle the adjustments. So continued focus on maintaining the reliability of the system and addressing the affordability concerns over the next little while. And I don't think that the pandemic has really altered that focus or that direction. I think we will see that it will change sort of the size and timing of some of the needs we had seen on the system. But in general, I think that the direction is still the same. We are in the process of refurbishing our nuclear fleet to give us a very clean sort of backbone of energy production. We continue to develop mechanisms to add new resources to the system. We continue to work closely with communities, our local distribution company partners in Hydro One and transmitters to do local reliability. So I think that the future is bright and that the sector is headed in the right direction.
Thanks, Chuck. Saad.
Wow. what's the world going to look like in 5 to 10 years? I'm not really sure I have any idea about that. I think there's lots of opportunity ahead of us, as I mentioned. I think the need to create more balance in the economy in terms of income would be a great place to start, but that requires stable jobs and stable opportunities. So I think there's a demand-driven reskilling, retraining opportunity. I think there's a green industry recovery that's sort of taking off globally, that I think Ontario and Toronto needs to get its piece or its share of that foreign direct investment. I think there are infrastructure and mobility opportunities in the near term to long term, not just in transit, but of course, transit is a key element of that. Bus priority lanes, continuing with the TTC's electrification program, I think that we talked about residential tower renewal as probably a great opportunity for efficiency gains. And so the change in business delivery that we just spoke about in terms of digitization, what is the long-term impact of that? There's probably a broadband, VPN infrastructure requirement that could be improved in several parts, geographic parts of the city. That may represent an opportunity. I don't know what the impact on the grid is from those types of moves. I think we also have to take a look at what the long-term implications are of a shift to perhaps continued work from home arrangements, or work from home arrangements that are in the main continuing for some time. What does that do to the downtown core? What does that do from a commercial revenue point of view for the city? What does that do to the redevelopment of some of those towers? And the Canadian Urban Institute has some very interesting ideas there. What's the knock-on effect on main streets going forward, and vacant properties, and what new elements will emerge? And I also think then that gets us to the need for a longer term set of actions that get to improving affordable housing, improving affordability and availability of childcare. There's an inordinate impact on women from this pandemic. And there's data that suggests, for example, for youth, that when youth graduate in a recession, they don't tend to ever get back to what they graduated in terms of a vocational or employment opportunity. If that's true, then it would be doubly true for women and newcomers. They're going to be competing with laid-off workers or temporary laid-off workers who already have deep experience to try to get into the labor force. I think if we can increase labor force participation in a more smooth way, then we increase prosperity. And of course, all incomes rise as a result of that. Now, the means of which to do that will be debated and vary dramatically. There's no question about that, and that's only right. But I think addressing these, what people would call social determinants of health, will drive down costs in other areas and have a clear ROI, and will increase growth and prosperity for the province and the country. So this sort of intersection of initiatives, I think, will hopefully be medium to long-term opportunities that allow Toronto to contribute to the growth trajectory that we're going to need coming out of this recession, this pandemic, just as it did in the last recession, but hopefully in a more balanced way in terms of labor force participation. Because we have a productivity drag by leaving certain groups behind: Indigenous, women, youth, seniors. And the prosperity and growth initiative out of Rotman in 2016 found that the reduced labor force participation of those four groups was a $54 billion GDP miss for the province, or drag.
Great, thank you, Saad. This pandemic does present quite the opportunity for us to rebuild our society and our electricity system into the society and electricity system that we want to see. And as part of that, there's a role for research groups such as Q at Ryerson, but also our friends at other universities and institutions as well. So it'd be nice to spend some time talking about potential research areas. We know more today than we knew 6 months ago. And we want to know more tomorrow and make sure that our choices, our policy choices and other choices are informed by evidence and by sound, sensible reasoning. So maybe we'll start with Chuck, if you could identify some potential research areas. We've partnered with, the IESO has partnered with Ryerson since the start, 10 years ago of Q. And we've done research in a number of different areas, including transactive energy, energy storage, conservation, and so on. What are the potential topics for the future?
So, well, it's a big sector, and so that means that there is so much opportunity to research and move things forward through pilots, white papers, and the like. So I would stay as wide open as I could, but some areas that that I'm particularly interested in. The first one is that, oddly enough, as a sector, we have very limited and I'll say poor information on how people actually use energy. And this is a real problem that we have to address. Many of the sort of end use surveys were done quite a long time ago, 2005. Some updates were done to that. But I think our understanding of how people use energy on the other side of the meter is quite weak. And so I think there's a large opportunity to better understand how people are using energy, but also how they intend to use energy, how they will be affected by sort of changing social norms, changing economics, changing circumstances. You know, if we go forward and look at addressing climate change, and I think we would all agree that electrification is such an important part of getting that done over some time frame, so that we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And I would always focus on the sort of use side of the equation first, because we have quite a clean system. Understanding what will make people make those decisions and make those choices, so that we can put in place the right policy supports and programs to those trends to happen, informed by information. Certainly there are all sorts of opportunities on the supply side. So we certainly are starting to see a lot more interest from the storage community, and we're doing a lot of stuff with storage. But similarly, I think we have to keep pushing the boundaries and understanding, because storage is not a generic concept. So we've got to push the boundaries and understand the best ways to deploy the various types of storage on the system. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And then finally mine, which I think speaks a little bit to resilience as well. And resilience means a lot of different things to a lot of people. As a grid operator, resilience is about how quickly you can restore systems after an event. But if you're a customer, it's how can you ride through an event. If you're a city, how can you keep people moving? How can you do these things, keep people warm, whatever it is you have to do. So resilience is one of these odd concepts that means different things to different people. But we do an awful lot of work in the local planning space across the province, a lot of active things going on in the sector. We have studies in Toronto to address the issues that Toronto are seeing. And so things that speak to coming up with new and innovative ways to address local needs and to improve the quality of service locally, I think are very, very important. Very excited about a pilot going on in Northern York region, which looks to, can local markets address that funding gap that distributed energy would have. So these are the sorts of areas to me, but I tend to personally to always try to focus to how people use energy, and that's an area that I think we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. It's you're right. There is a lot of work for us to do on the end use and the people focus for our work in energy and electricity. So I'd like to ask Saad to tell us more about the human side and societal impacts, and where research could help us become more resilient.
Yeah, maybe I'll pick up where Chuck left off in terms of the use side of things, as you say, Jessie. My own interest would be in the area of what are the best investments in the public realm, and the built form for a couple different areas because reasons. Because as we've talked about, I think hyper local type of activity is starting to emerge. Again, work from home arrangements, better ability for people to be closer to where they work and live closer to where they work. I think the reason we're seeing overcrowding, as some have pointed out recently in the press on buses, is that I'm led to understand that the majority of subway rides begin and end with the bus ride. That's because people can't afford to live near where they work, and this applies to many essential and necessary workers. So how can you create what planners are calling more complete communities, or the 15-minute community? And how can that be done in a way that is efficient and creates a more smoothed understanding of demand? And the city has done something quite smart in that, I say that because I have nothing to do with it, but has done something quite smart because it has 8 post-secondary institutions within the city, and colleges and universities. And so it has a research MOU with all of them. And each one, in combination with others or by themselves, have picked various subjects. And it's a very long list, but a couple that come to mind are, what are the labor market trends in the next 3 to 5 years? And again, this speaks to your previous question and to some of Chuck's points in terms of energy demand and what are some emerging sectors? And what does storage look like? Is that an opportunity for Toronto? What is a green recovery, and what are the sectoral components of that? And is this an opportunity for reskilling and retraining so that we can get more people back into the workforce? The second one that sort of caught my eye as well gets back to the theme we've been talking about in terms of digital access. Who's underserved, who's well served, and as a bigger issue. We know from feedback and engagement that was done over the last 5 or 6 months, there's a strong concern about the availability of vulnerable populations to community spaces and the digital divide that is created for them, so that they don't get a chance to engage and contribute to decision-making like others might be able to. And as we move to many more things in the virtual world, I think we need to address those issues and figure out how we can make that a more equitable opportunity for groups to be participants in the decisions that affect them, so that they understand how they consume, they understand how they can be part of a solution, and the system can be part of a solution for the improvements as well. So those would be a few areas, but I think that the city is quite lucky to be aligned with these 8 institutions, of course, Ryerson being one of them.
Great. Thank you, Saad. I think now would be a good time to take questions from the audience. I'll invite my colleague, Dr. Bala Venkatesh, who's the academic director for the Center for Urban Energy, to help moderate this portion. We'll be using the Q&A feature that's in Zoom, so please put your questions there. We've covered a wide breadth of areas. If you'd like to go in depth into any of them, please let us know. Go ahead, Bala.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for the engaging conversation there. We have some questions on the Q&A, and I'm going to go through them. Some of them are specifically labeled as for Chuck, so I'm going to go through them. All right, great. So the first question here that is asked, how much has the hold on time of use pricing affected the peak?
So actually, I don't know the answer to that. As I say, I don't think it was one of the more impactful things that happened over the last 6-7 months. Time of use was having an impact on causing people to shift usage and reducing peak. There are varying studies and assessments of how effective the program was, but putting it on hold, frankly, in the middle of a pandemic event, we would be unable right now to isolate the effect of that, because frankly, the lifestyle changes have overwhelmed it.
Thank you, Chuck. And I do recollect seeing the slides that you had shown at the beginning of this session, where you've shown that the residential sector, in fact, had an increase in its peak demand. And the industrial and commercial sectors have had a reduction. It's not a whole lot, it's just about 8 to 15%. So I thought I'll sneak in one of my own burning questions to both Chuck, you and Saad there. Is that there's a GDP reduction, I presume, and there is also this electricity reduction. Are they correlated or are they different? That's the question that kind of comes to my mind. And so the electricity sector, you did show that there is about 8 to 15% reduction, both in the peak and the energy consumption. So I thought I wanted both of you to reflect on the reduction on the energy consumption, and also probably Saad has a number on the reduction of GDP possibly captured in some sense, and if they correlate or not. So I invite you both to reflect on it and see if there's a correlation there.
So I can go first with the correlation, and actually since about the early 2000s, the correlation of GDP to electricity demand has weakened significantly. And if you think about the period since the last crisis in 2008, 2009, sudden shock to the system, everything dropped, but then slow growth of GDP as service sectors grew, et cetera. The reality is electricity demand did not grow in that time. And so while I wouldn't say there is no correlation, increased output will lead to more demand. I think the forces at play on the system, like enhanced energy efficiency, so we're doing things in a much more efficient way. We're living in smaller homes on balance as we have more and more smaller condos, et cetera. And frankly, our industrial sector is not as energy intensive as it used to be. Those things have countered that. So when we do our forecasting, we do find employment is quite a good indicator. And so we tend to look to employment numbers to help us understand what's going to happen with demand as we look forward.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Bala. We've all seen the data. I'm not an economist, but we've all seen the data on the hit to GDP that COVID has demonstrated. I think it could have been much worse if we had a different interest rate structure, of course. Could have been much worse if we didn't have all levels of government working together to step up and provide supports, critical supports for residents, citizens. But I also think that it calls out the inefficiency or lack of diversity that GDP as a measure has. And in order to get a better sense of how an economy is performing, I think you have many jurisdictions around the world and US states looking at differing measures of prosperity. For example, you have a sort of a gender balanced analysis plus out of the federal government that is required for every submission and initiative that goes forward. So I think there's an emerging interest in looking at other measures that give you a better sense of how an economy is doing. And that really does speak to some of the points on increasing labor force participation, thereby driving prosperity. I'm not advocating for a happiness index as one country has gone to, but I do think we can get a little bit more nuanced in understanding how we come out of shocks and crises like pandemics, like blackouts, etc. And we can do that with a more evolved sense of a set of metrics.
Fantastic, thank you. There are some technical questions here that I would send Chuck's way. The first one here, what was the main reason for the decision to freeze ICI program? Is that something that you want to take there, Chuck?
Well, the program firstly is the government's program. The decision to put it on hiatus was the government. So I think it would be important for the government to give its reason. In their stated releases, it was to enable industry to focus on recovering, on producing, as opposed to responding to the electricity system requirements. They saw the recovery as much more important at this time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chuck. There is another question that, I thought I'll slip in. That's my own. You did mention about build back better. Didn't add Bala there, but that's all right. Chuck, sorry, Saad, you did mention about the build back better. In your view, as we go forward, what do you anticipate and expect that will come out probably in the next 1 year's time? And what concrete actions can the society take and possibly the electricity sector can support in that process?
Well, I think there are several infrastructure initiatives that the city already has. I sort of want to stay away from terms like shovel ready, because that sort of smacks of more gazebos and ice rinks. But there are some very impactful projects ready to go. There's green infrastructure stimulus program the feds have. The province has already signaled a deep interest in transit initiatives, and we've seen progress even during the pandemic on that, which I think is very encouraging. And so I think those could be things that could get started. I think some of the elements of impact on the electricity system would be clear there. I think continued procurement of the TTC's e-bus program, where they had an announcement not that long ago, is another positive sign. I think looking at clean tech, AI, data analytics sectors, and how we can leverage Toronto's deep knowledge and ecosystem of companies to contribute to a green recovery in the near term. And I'm talking about supply chain opportunities, spreading out foreign direct investment opportunities. So those are a few things that come immediately to mind. And I think that working with colleges, universities, businesses who are interested, creating internship and apprenticeship programs, very similar to what the construction trades have done for women and Indigenous communities, to help with retraining and reskilling and creating new opportunities for, I think, youth and women especially. These are initiatives that can start right away, and they may have implications for various sectors. The other piece would be a lot of the retooling that's taken place in the manufacturing sector very recently. You look at the province's announcement with Linamar just yesterday, and how they've gone and retooled some of their production facilities to create ventilators that allows them to bring back staff that had to be laid off. And so that'll be interesting to see what kind of, I recognize Chuck has said that, commercial and industrial are less, industrial is less of a draw than maybe commercial residential, but what kind of impacts does that have on energy demand, I think will be an interesting one. That to me would be some immediate near-term hopeful opportunities.
Great, thank you, Saad. Any reflection on that, Chuck?
Well, I think Saad said it well, and from our perspective, there's a lot of stuff that was already underway. A lot of large infrastructure projects. The nuclear refurbishment program has immense knock-on effects. That is underway, and it's heading towards its height around the 23-25 timeframe. And so these are things that I think will help support the sort of Build Back Better idea. We've been doing a lot of work with the various authorities to prepare for transit build-outs. Again, that was something that was underway and is accelerating now. And it's quite impactful as you get into how you supply electricity to local areas. We've been working closely with Toronto Hydro, Metrolinx, TTC, et cetera, to understand how we can help serve those increasing needs. It's exciting to see what TTC is doing with the bus fleet. These are all very positive things. And then an area that I think we also want to be prepared for, not so much in Toronto, but there are some very positive economic growth stories emerging. And so particularly in Southwestern Ontario, there's a very significant build out of the greenhouse sector, which is stressing the energy infrastructure to be able to supply that. So focusing on that, because we don't want the infrastructure to be the limiting factor to these recoveries. And so really working closely right across the province to understand where the pressure points are so that we can be part of the solution.
Fantastic, thank you. There are a few questions, and I'll probably paraphrase those questions because they are similar. they connect to working from home. So working from home has been a new reality for lots of millions of Canadians, and that has brought increased pressures in terms of energy requirements, which is reflected on your charts there, Chuck, and also with regards to economic feasibility and social awareness. So while the emphasis is upon transit and so on, which is very important, and they contribute to significant amount of greenhouse gases today, and the electric infrastructure there would significantly help. Would you be able to comment about working from home, energy requirements for working from home? We've encountered hottest days in the last couple of months where air conditioning has been a great requirement. And so working from home, how can we make it environmentally friendly? And what can we do to ensure that the costs are low? So those are the questions that have come about. There is another twist to that question. How can we use renewable energy and storage to make working from home more reliable and resilient?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I would suggest that we've been through what I'm going to think of as the peak work from home period, because people were forced home. And now we're coming out of that, and gradually people are starting to get back to the kind of schedule. So you're starting to see sort of a return. And so I don't know that the conditions that we have seen through the past summer will be the conditions that we will see next year, but I know it will be different to what we're used to. So we do have to think about that in the context of the system. And I would also say that as far as I know, we have been quite, the term resilient was used, there haven't really been any issues in supplying this changed demand. We've been able to get through some extremely hot weather, some other changes that were put in place. There have been some supply side impacts as a result of the pandemic, as people had to defer maintenance, etc. So we've gotten through it. So we have I would stress, we have a very good system. We have a resilient system. But as we go forward, and it's not just about work from home, but I do think that the solution, as energy needs grow, and energy needs will grow, whether it's through electrification, population growth, new initiatives, as energy needs grow, there will be a continued and increased role for distributed energy. And so I would suggest that we need to think about the best ways to integrate distributed energy into our electricity system, to give customers the ability to adopt distributed energy, and that can help them manage their bills, and also find ways for them to act as microgrids communities so that they can be resilient as a small community. I think there are immense opportunities in that way. And my final one is, it doesn't matter, we are at home using more energy. I urge everyone to use energy as efficiently as they can. It is a finite resource. And there are some very, very good energy efficiency program supports. I'm sure there could be more and better. So working with your LDC, working with your energy advisors, all very, very important.
Thank you, Chuck. I'll give the floor to Saad if you have words to add.
I would just say what Chuck said.
That's great. That's great. We are just about few seconds away from 2 p.m. I realize, and I see Jessie's eyes moving back and forth from the clock. So, at this time, there are lots of open questions, and I would urge who has asked questions to reach out to Jessie, and she can help respond where possible through Chuck and Saad. So thank you so much for taking our questions there, and from all those who are on the webinar. So I'll hand it back to Jessie there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bella. And thank you, Chuck, Saad, and thank you to the audience as well for your excellent engagement today. If anybody would like to explore a project with CUE, with the Center for Urban Energy, please contact Bella at bella@ryerson.ca. Please also follow CUE on social media or visit our website to sign up for our monthly newsletter to find out about upcoming events. This includes Leading the Charge, our annual energy storage conference on October 8th. So thank you again. See you next time. Bye for now.